Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Puentes, President and CEO of the ENO Center for Transportation, and I want to welcome you to this webinar for a report that we're releasing today, Adopting and Adapting States and Automated Vehicle Policy. The report authors are Paul Lewis, Greg Rogers, and Stanford Turner, here from ENO, and they'll be presenting the report in just a minute. This work was informed by the experts on the advisory board for our Digital Cities project, which is a comprehensive initiative here at ENO exploring how technology is changing transportation and how policy at all levels can encourage innovative policy and practice while protecting the public interest for all segments of society. ENO is at the forefront of these issues and this revolution in transportation technology. Just last month, we released a major report called Beyond Speculation, AVs and Public Policy, which was aimed mostly at the federal government, but presented a federalist approach to automated vehicle technology. In a few weeks, we're going to be releasing another paper aimed mostly on the local level, but this report here is aimed at the state level and focusing how states should prepare for a future of autonomous vehicles by adapting their approach to vehicle regulations, to infrastructure investment, and to research. This was all informed by intensive work that we've been doing around the country with consultations and workshops and various work with states, again, all around the country from coast to coast. So the authors will present the paper, then they'll take your questions that you can submit through the chat function on the webinar website. I encourage you to do that during the course of the presentation. I think you will find the report and discussion today very interesting and super timely. I want to thank you all again for taking the time to join us today. With that, let me turn it over to the report's co-authors and start with Paul Lewis.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to start off by going through some of the background that we have in the paper, explaining our approach and diving into some of the recommendations that we have for the regulations. So when we started this work, there were three main challenges we identified as it relates to putting together policies at the state level. The first challenge is that the technology firms are developing smart vehicles, not smart infrastructure, that are able to apply and navigate the roadways we have right now without a massive coordinated government-run investment structure. So from a public policy standpoint, that means that states have to create and make a delicate balance between what, first to support the AV development rather than coordinating widespread investment efforts. The challenge is the definition of AVs, and this is where we spent a lot of time working. And up on the screen, you all see the graphic from page 5 on our report that outlines the 6 different levels of automation as published by SAE and NHTSA. AVs are not a single technology, and policymakers have to keep the different levels of automation in mind when thinking about AV policy. And we're going to go into some of these specifics as we go through the recommendations. And the final challenge that we identified is that AVs don't exist today on a widespread level. Yes, there are pilots, and there are some low-level 1 and level 2 automated vehicle technology on the roadway in commercially ready vehicles. But from the large part, level 3, 4, and 5 vehicles don't exist, and it's very challenging to create a policy for something that you don't even know how it's going to be deployed, whether that's in a shared fleet model, whether that's individual ownership, when and where and how these vehicles can be deployed, and how to do it in a safe manner. So these three things provide a groundwork for a lot of work for states as they try to navigate the policy landscape. And when we looked at each state, we found that each one has a very different approach. We identified and grouped together 4 different categories of state-level automated vehicle policy. Again, this is somewhat crude, and there are some overlaps between the 4 categories, and it's also changing by the day. But generally, the four categories are: first, states that don't have any regulations or laws that pertain to AVs. It's not that these states are unaware or don't care about automated vehicle policy, but many of them are just either waiting for the technology to develop more, or they're currently working on legislation as we speak. The second category is states that have some kind of limited interest through an executive order, a pilot program, an advisory committee, but haven't gone the full step of creating specific AV legislation. Those are highlighted on the map in light blue. The third category is states that have enacted broad piloting or testing laws that enable the permitting and reporting requirements and the testing environment for automated vehicles as defined by the state legislature. And then the final category is states that not only allow the testing, but also allow fully automated vehicles without drivers in them to either now or sometime in the future navigate roadways throughout the states. So within those four categories, it's important to recognize that just because a state has passed AV legislation, that does not mean that it's necessarily good or bad for the industry or for the general public. What we're trying to highlight through this map is that what it's creating is a patchwork across the country of very different approaches to regulation that is at best or annoying for testing, but when we go to commercial development, it could be very problematic to consumers as they try to navigate a regulatory environment that could disrupt interstate travel. So based on that, we started to create recommendations, as Rob mentioned, for regulations, for infrastructure investment, and for research and workforce. I'm going to start with talking about AV regulations at the state level and give a high-level overview of the 8 items that we identified in the paper for regulations. And our approach here was to make sure that these regulations first ensure public safety, 2, provide consistent framework for AV developers, and 3, create an environment where the rules can adapt to unknown future scenarios. And that's really underpinning all of this approach. There's no one-size-fits-all model legislation for every single state at this time. Some states might choose to pass laws, others might choose to take executive actions, others prefer maybe not to take any steps right away, and there can be pitfalls with any one of these methods, but state governments have to decide what's right for them and their own context. What our recommendations do is provide some general guidelines for any of these approaches so that they can help deploy this technology in a way that accomplishes the goals that I just set out. So the first bullet on this page is states need to consider that legislation or regulatory action will not necessarily attract or deter testing. AV laws are only a part of the whole approach and attraction or detraction for AV testing in the state. There needs to be an entire ecosystem of automakers, tech firms, research institutes, localities, advocates, and safety groups involved in order for widespread testing to occur in any state. So the point of this first bullet is just to not put all of the economic development eggs into the basket of creating legislation or an executive action. The second bullet here is one of the most important things that states can do, and it's adhering to consistent definitions. One thing we found when we looked at state legislation and executive actions all over the country is that every state defines automated vehicles slightly differently. And this is a very dangerous patchwork, because not only could some of the regulations not line up between states, but the actual definition of what we're talking about could change as you cross the state border. Whether that's in Tennessee that calls it autonomous technology, or Michigan, which is an automated motor vehicle, or any other state that has its own definition. our recommendation is that states should stick to the SAE NHTSA level definitions and use them as the base framework when developing AV policies at the state level. The third bullet is to not over-design reporting requirements for AV testing. This is something we spend a lot of time talking with auto manufacturers, tech companies, AV developers around the country, and states can and should design balanced reporting requirements that meet state needs for transparency and safety, but aren't overly burdensome on AV testers. Every AV company we talked to was not opposed to having some kind of testing requirement or permitting, so long as the process was not over bureaucratic, cumbersome, or reveals proprietary corporate information. So that's an important thing to recognize. And the fourth bullet on this list is that states should harmonize current and future tort liability and national safety standards. This is really the traditional state role. So states should continue to lead in areas where they've always had a role, which is in licensing of human drivers, enforcing traffic laws, regulating insurance and liability. States should think about assigning crash liability not to whomever, but whatever is responsible for the driving task if there's an at-fault collisions. And AV developers should be ready to assume liability if their technology is responsible for a crash. And AV firms should have insurance to cover the costs of those accidents when it's their fault. States should also work with NHTSA and their neighbors to create uniformity as much as they can from state to state. This is not a requirement. As we know right now, insurance requirements and liability already differs from state to state, and that can be somewhat of a headache to drivers. AV technology requires even more coordination in order for seamless deployment of this technology. And then finally, states should allow NHTSA and the federal government to take the primary lead on developing some kind of safety certification system to make sure that the technology is safe to deploy on roadways. We talked about this extensively in our Beyond Speculation paper we released last month, and it's something that that states should continue to look to the federal government for leadership. On the next slide, we have the final four items that we talk about in regulations. I'm going to go through these before turning it over to my colleague. The first is, on this page at least, is reviewing and updating current traffic laws. There's a lot on the books right now that unintentionally prohibits some of the main features of automated vehicles. There's a lot of states that prohibit talking or texting on cell phones. There's states that require licensed drivers to be present and operating a vehicle on the roadway, or states that that make sure that vehicles can't be left unattended. These are things that in an automated vehicle world could be in direct conflict with what we're trying to achieve. So the first thing that states can do here is go through the laws at the state and local level, see what might be in conflict, and proactively modify those laws so that they can allow for permitted AV systems to operate on public roadways. Still, we need to make sure that the safety requirements on the books for human drivers remain in place, because those are often on the books for very good reasons. The second bullet point here is authorizing specific pilot programs. Even if a state does not have widely permissive laws for AV testing or pilots, they can authorize specific areas where a university or a private sector partner can pilot a automated vehicle, often perhaps even with a public transit agency, to test some of the applications of driverless technology, level 4 or level 5 technology on the roadways. The third item here we feel like is a very important one for all states, and frankly localities can do as well, is creating advisory committees. Every state should put together some kind of task force, and many states have already started this process, to help inform smart AV policies at the state level. We suggest creating advisory committees of no more than 30 people, but should include representatives from state government offices, local governments, automobile manufacturers, AV technology firms, safety advocates, public transit industry groups, the taxi and trucking industry, and other relevant experts that can add to the discussion. We can rely on industry associations or rotating seats to make sure that the sizes of these groups remain manageable, yet we include perspectives from different organizations across the board. The final recommendation we have for AV regulations is on some of the other remaining issues that are hard to fully define right now. Here we're talking about issues such as privacy, data sharing, consumer advocacy, roadway safety, cybersecurity. Instead of creating hard and fast regulations or legislation at the state level for these issues, particularly since we don't know how a lot of these issues are going to play out over the next few years or a few decades, we suggest that states create statements of principles where they can have 9 non-binding statements that address topics like privacy, where they can delineate expectations about data ownership. They can specify privacy of vehicle owners and companies. They can look at things like cybersecurity and inform any operator in the state that they must conform to international standards for cybersecurity, and perhaps ensure some kind of limited liability so that AV developers take cybersecurity very seriously. Importantly, states should emphasize through these statements of principles that AVs must be able to recognize, yield to, and share the roadway with all users on public roads. This includes pedestrians, bicyclists, motorcyclists, people with disabilities, transit vehicles, and any other user that's currently on the roadways. While it's inherent in the AV system that these users are part of the transportation system and they will be recognized by the technology, it can be important for states to reiterate this to the general public that they're taking it very seriously, and any AV company operating in the state should abide by these broader statements of principles. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Stanford Turner, who's going to talk about infrastructure investment and funding at the state level. Stan.
Thanks, Paul. So, apologies now for my sore throat. With the increased testing of automated vehicles on public roads across the nation, it's becoming progressively important for continued maintenance of infrastructure. Predictable driving environments like well-marked traffic lanes and clear and consistent signage are essential for AV technology. This leads to our first recommendation: invest in improving roadways' state of good repair. Current automated vehicle technology works best on well-maintained and marked roads. This means even pavements, clear stripe lanes, and consistent signage. States should concentrate resources and create support for a robust state of good repair programs targeting unsafe roadways and work zones. By employing a fix-it-first approach to infrastructure investment, it will likely prove to be both prudent and cost-effective in the long run. Also, by prioritizing maintenance of existing road and infrastructure, a state will be able to ensure the long-term health of its transportation network, not just for AVs, but for all current drivers as well. A priority should be placed on known safety problems or to high-risk areas such as work zones to start. States can also emphasize AV-friendly roadways in pilot programs. One of the examples we highlight within our paper is Virginia's automated corridor, which includes high-quality lane markings as a primary resource for its testing corridor. Move on to the next recommendation, which is pilot connected vehicles projects. Increased vehicle connectivity has the potential to enhance the safety and efficiency benefits of AVs. While connected vehicles, which runs the gamut of vehicle to vehicle, vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to pedestrian, vehicle to device, and vehicle to everything, it's distinctly different from automated vehicles. And the importance of these two technologies working together, though, has the potential to yield considerable benefits for states. The U.S. DOT believes that connected vehicles, if you take into account 100% market penetration, has the potential to eliminate up to 80% of unimpaired crash scenarios and could save tens of thousands of lives each year. The agency is supporting numerous connected vehicle projects in Florida, Montana, and New York. States are also pursuing how best to implement this technology as well. For example, in Michigan, the Ann Arbor Connected Vehicle Test Environment began when the Department of Transportation and the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute launched its predecessor, the Safety Pilot Model Deployment in 2012. This 3-year project, which included $30 million in research funding, included over 2,800 vehicles and 73 miles of lane of connected infrastructure along the roadway. But the challenge for policymakers is that the underlying technology of connected vehicles could change. For now, CVs relied on dedicated short-range communications as the means to transmit data. In the future, some other method like 5G may overtake it, but states should attempt to capture the value from this technology. So our suggestion for states is to initiate pilots of GSRC and 5G wireless CV technologies, particularly when a private entity is willing to support the pilot financially. Additionally, we suggest incorporating CV and AV technologies into state vehicle fleets as states turn over their vehicles and purchase new ones. Features like vehicle connectivity or automatic emergency braking, blind spot monitoring, or advanced cruise control can really help prevent both collisions and really pilot a new technology. Now, our last recommendation is to consider developing a per-mile AV fee in concert with the federal government. In our previous report, Beyond Speculation, we recommended the federal government develop a per-mile charge for automated vehicles. We are also making that recommendation for states as well. With the expected infrastructure costs associated with the operation of self-driving vehicles, improving roadways to accommodate AV technologies will impose significant costs for states. Between the maintenance of public roadways and the potential loss of revenue, which can include fuel taxes, parking, and traffic tickets, states will have significant financial burdens to address. Conveniently, though, AV technology provides an opportunity to implement a pretty straightforward vehicle miles traveled fee. Companies are laying the groundwork now for early AVs to be a mobility service. By charging consumers by a trip or by the mile, this would allow for the easy administration of such a fee at the government level, rather than creating 150 million accounts across the nation. So our action items for states is research different approaches to implementing and using VMT fees on AVs as a way to create not only new revenue streams for state transportation investments, but to encourage the responsible use of AVs on public roadways. An example would be Tennessee. Tennessee passed a law that would charge a VMT fee for AVs at a rate of 1 cent per mile for 2-axle vehicles and approximately 2 cents per mile for more than 2 axles. While it has yet to be implemented, the state will divide the revenue generated from this charge between the state's general fund, the state highway fund, counties and localities, and according to the statutory formula. The federal government is also interested in encouraging VMT fees. The 2015 FAST Act set aside $95 million over 5 years for VMT research. Potentially, states could use this revenue to fund not only public infrastructure investments, but take into account different vehicle types, occupancy levels, congestion, and other variables to assist with environmental outcomes or traffic. Policymakers should be mindful of market distortions related to VMT and consider using discounts and other incentives to encourage the beneficial adoption of AV technology. At this point, this is a fairly straightforward action item. It's also particularly politically viable. In the last election cycle, we saw numerous states really increase their gas taxes right now, and so as a means to offset particular costs associated with AVs or potentially as alternative revenue streams, we would highly suggest the use of VMTs within the states. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Greg Rogers to talk about the next steps.
Thank you, Stan. I'll be discussing the research and workforce issues that states have an opportunity to address as AV technology continues to develop, is tested on public roads, and is developed. The first thing to realize is that while a state's authority often begins and ends at its borders, they have have a tremendous opportunity to really enhance our understanding of AVs nationally, across industries, and even globally. They can do this by funding research efforts, and also entering into partnerships with private entities and also public universities in order to foster AV testing and research. And these research efforts can take a variety of forms. This can be researching the potential environmental impacts of AVs as they're deployed in different scenarios, whether it's by, as Stan mentioned earlier, establishing DMT fees that discourage the use of AVs with only one passenger or no passengers. But one thing to remember here is that AV research has been ongoing for decades. And there's an old adage that really rings true in this issue, and it's that the conclusion of every research project is that you need more research. So the first place to start is that states should foster the creation of AV testing grounds. One of the primary reasons for this is that we currently don't know exactly if we can build a consensus in the near future on how AVs should be certified for their safety. There are three options right now for evaluating the safety of AVs. You can use any combination of them, or one or just one that you select. But often we're finding that automakers and tech firms are using a variety of them. And these are to test on public roads, as we've seen in California with over 30 different companies. You can test on private or closed tracks or facilities, or connecting computer simulations where the variables of the other obstacles on the road are moving at different speeds, different trajectories, and really allowing for more complexity in understanding how the automated system interacts with the built environment, as well as other vehicles around it. One example of a state that created a really beneficial testing ground is Michigan. The University of Michigan, the American Center for Mobility Will Run was actually authorized by the Michigan State Legislature. And this is built on an old World War II factory site that was used to build bombers. And after that, it was used for constructing powertrains on this facility. It was retired about 5-10 years ago or so, but now it's being repurposed using all of the infrastructure that's already there, such as freeway infrastructure, city streets, and also this mixture of urban and rural environments. And it's currently being retooled in order to allow companies in Michigan to test AVs in a variety of environments by also simulating all of those variables. And for those states that were designated, that have areas designated under the 10 US DOT proving grounds that were announced in January, they have an opportunity to partner with private and public firms, as well as contribute to the ongoing collection of research and testing information around AVs. The real value here is that this is creating a working group that will have national implications and the opportunity to really benefit not only the other companies that are testing AVs, but also DOT as it tries to understand how it will measure AV performance and safety. Additionally, states should fund research in the integration of AVs into their transportation networks to assess their impacts on their transit agencies, on their environmental, on reaching their environmental targets, and so on. And the University of Michigan Mobility Transformation Center was actually one of the most important parts of this so far. Its flagship facility, M-City, just released a report last week or the week before that outlined a way to test AVs, which would actually allow for us to certify the safety of them faster than before. Again, this contributes to not just the economy of Michigan by allowing automakers to develop AVs faster and ensure they are safe, but also allows the federal government to understand how, when, and where it should be testing AVs. Their method actually found that you can reduce the cost of testing AVs by as much as 99.99%, which is just a huge margin. And the reason for this is that they found ways to concentrate on those rare instances and simulate them where accidents would actually happen, or collisions rather. This will also allow to reduce the testing time required by 300 to 100,000 times. Also tremendously important for the federal government moving forward, but also for Michigan. And Michigan's entire goal in funding these projects was to allow its local economy to gain a greater understanding of this changing environment, which is really what states should be looking at, is ways to figure out how to benefit their constituents through economic programs, through research that's targeted towards their workforces, and so forth. We also recommend that states should revise their research procurement methods and allow the results to keep pace with the rapid development of AV technology. And procurement for research should be targeting outcomes rather than specific processes of researching different issues. And additionally, by gaining this greater understanding, states can be able to, over time, include AVs in their long-range plans, which is being done across the country already. But however, they should look at AVs not as just a given outcome, but more as a potential scenario to anticipate and prepare for. Moving on to workforce, there's a lot of consternation about how AVs will impact the workforce of the future. There are massive concerns about displacement on one end, and on the other end are those who believe that these disruptions have happened many, many times due to automation and the advances of technology. But one thing is certain, though, and it's that 29 states, in 29 states, the #1 most common job is that of a truck driver. And in total, there are 3.7 million trucking jobs, trucking, bus driving, et cetera, jobs in the U.S. But it might actually start sooner as we start to see fewer and fewer accidents occur. Some of the 915,000 workers in auto shops and collision repair shops may begin to see sort of a disruption in the demand for their positions. And for this reason, we recommend that states begin to research the potential impacts of automation on not just truck drivers and bus drivers, but also the economy as a whole to gain a greater understanding. But I want to pull out two major threads here, and that is of truck drivers and transit operators. Starting with truck drivers, trucking is currently a grueling job, and there's constantly a shortage of truck drivers. It's a difficult job, and often a frequent challenge is ensuring that truck drivers are always one of the challenges is making sure that truck drivers are always available in order to connect shippers with their goods. As a result, one of the things that we're going to see is that we might be able to automate the task of trucking on the longer stretches of highway, which would allow truckers to actually open up, the truckers' time to conduct more productive tasks such as designing the next route, taking inventory, etc. And this would really allow for the job to become somewhat more desirable into the future. In the long run, currently, trucking interests and folks involved in this that are studying this space don't exactly see that there's going to be an immediate disruption in truck drivers' jobs. Moving on to transit, this is one of the most exciting opportunities. As transit operations begin to be automated, we'll actually be able to look at and even reimagine the job of a bus driver. As buses are increasingly automated, we might have the opportunity to look at how bus drivers can become more of a transit concierge who is able to focus on collecting fares, providing greater services to passengers, assisting elderly passengers, assisting people with disabilities, and also ensuring that the buses are safe and clean at all times. So what we see here is a heaven and hell scenario. It's that either automation will trigger massive displacement, or on the other end, automated vehicles may actually require more high-tech jobs to be created, and might allow for the bus driver of the future to be a transit concierge or someone who actually operates the fleet remotely. These are things that states should begin to research. And we've already seen examples of how automation and globalization can disrupt regional economies as well as state economies. And actually, about 50 years ago was when the first job retraining program was started in the Midwest, with varied results. And in order to really prepare for and respond to the potential disruptions of automation, states really should be focusing on looking at opportunities to address those early on. So, in conclusion, states moving forward should carefully assess what their objectives are when passing automated vehicle policies. They should be looking at the economic, social, and environmental impacts of their actions, and also realize that there is a delineation between the federal, state, and local roles in regulating motor vehicles and enforcing traffic laws. And therefore, states should really be focusing on their core responsibilities of maintaining roads, ensuring that there's clear signage and adequate lane markings and no potholes, and also prepare for and research the future of their workforces and advance overall the collective knowledge around AVs. I'm going to turn it back to Rob Fuentes, who will be leading our Q&A.
That's great. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Dan and Paul. I think so. As folks on the phone can understand, there's a lot that goes into all of this. Again, the reports try to sift through the comments and the concerns and the questions that we've got from states and officials all across the country. But there's a lot here, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface on this, even with this comprehensive report. So, again, I would encourage you to submit some questions through the chat feature on the webinar website. We've already got a whole bunch coming in, so let's go ahead and just jump right into some big picture stuff. There's a bunch of questions around, and we've actually seen this as we've been working on this project. States often think about, or there's an insatiable kind of demand for them to attract firms because they think that it's going to create some kind of economic development strategy. And Paul, your interesting comment that there's this bilateral conventional wisdom that AV laws and regulations are either going to attract AV firms, or if they're done wrong, they're going to deter AV firms and pilots. You mentioned this idea of this AV ecosystem, which I think is really interesting. Can you talk a little bit about more about that and who's doing that right?
Yeah, it's hard to say what it is that actually attracts firms to test automated vehicles in a particular state. We looked at California, that has some of the most restrictive permitting and reporting requirements, and they also have some of the most prolific AV testing in that state. Meanwhile, Tennessee passed a law last year to explicitly try to encourage AV testing in the state, and to date, there's been very little testing actually done in that state. And so it's more than just having a law or not having a law, but it's encouraging the entire ecosystem to develop and deploy in your state. And frankly, not all states are going to have full multi-company testing on every roadway. There's just not enough to go around, and really it's not as many jobs as it might seem in the short run. In the long run, even in the medium run, I think we'll see AV companies testing in every state and deploying in every state. But during this testing phase, the laws that are on the books are only a part of the total package of what encourages or discourages AV testing.
So another question just came in around this issue of, kind of related to the regs and the rules, about making reporting requirements, or a recommendation not to make the reporting requirements overly bureaucratic. obviously that's in the eye of the beholder. How can we say more about what's overly bureaucratic and what is that sweet spot between doing what we have to do to report these things and then not making it thwarting the pilots and demonstrators?
Certainly. That definitely is one of the challenges that we're seeing, is that as it is, California's reporting requirements do require that automakers and tech firms submit a report at the end of the year with their miles driven, their disengagements, that is to say how often they've turned off the automated system and the cause of it, as well as the number of collisions, etc. Now, reporting collisions certainly makes sense and is a responsible thing to do on behalf of the companies. But one thing that we keep on seeing every single time that these annual disengagement reports are released is that reporters will often go into the reports and look through them, and they're highly technical a lot of the time, and they don't really explain a lot of the reasons for a disengagement. So you can imagine, for example, say that Uber or Lyft or another rideshare company chooses to operate a rideshare service in California. It's very difficult, and as a former Uber and Lyft driver myself, I can say it was very difficult to find your passenger, to make sure that you are pulling over at the right place safely, and ensuring that you're not hitting a cyclist. It's even harder to try to tell an AV to pull over at the right time to do so. So you can imagine how these disengagement reports can be actually a problem in the long run, and how maybe they should be designed in a way that will help to increase consumer understanding of the vehicles, but also don't allow for a significant margin of error when these are being reported in the media.
So really, it's a balancing part of it's just a technological problem. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, and in the paper we talk about the disengagement report, saying that reporting every single disengagement doesn't necessarily provide us with the information we want, but even AV developers said that if there's a collision or if there's a serious safety issue, that would be a perfectly responsible thing for them to report. And this also is why we suggest having each state put together a multi-stakeholder working group. You can get a bunch of very smart people in the same room to hash out some of these issues, and really try to develop that right balance. And really, it's convening people and talking is going to be a huge part of making that right recommendation.
Got it. So there's a few questions in here and comments about this issue of connected vehicles, and I think there's a lot of confusion and a lot of discussion about it, but I like the way that this paper actually makes the connection between AVs and CVs, the point being that AVs need to be connected to fully realize the benefits. And Stan talked a little bit about the technology that's being developed for this. What should states be thinking about from a technology standpoint? How do they think about the investments that they need to make to encourage this connection between CVs and AVs?
Sure, thank you. So the challenges right now that I guess many policymakers are facing is this decision of whether to go forward with DSRC or to wait for 5G technologies to come around, which also has the potential to kind of do many of the same things within a connected vehicle. At this point, we're not advocating for either or. We definitely recognize the value of having this technology within autonomous vehicles. It will only help in terms of operational components of it. So our best bet, I think, is to move forward with pilot. I think each state should really make a concerted effort to kind of figure out where and what's the best location to kind of deploy a pilot within their own state. I know that there may be some reticence about an early investment. However, having said that, the safety benefits may outweigh that.
Yes. How do they make a big bet on what technology to invest? Is Virginia the one they're making?
Yeah,
just recently
Virginia has a connected corridor as well.
Connected corridor.
Yes.
So sticking with the specific states, I think we all noticed that just recently, I think it was this week, New York, through Governor Cuomo, approved their state's first AV demonstration application. I think there's been some criticism. I think on first glance, they probably could have benefited from reading this paper up in New York State. Greg, any critiques or comments on what New York has put together in the context of what you guys have talked about here?
Yeah, I certainly have a few thoughts. The issue with the New York AV bill is that it was inserted into the New York State's budget and didn't really seem to get a lot of, let's say, scrutiny or deeper research to understand what its true impacts would be. The project that was approved will be a test by Audi of AV3s that will have one engineer in the front of the vehicle and one front seat rather, and one in the back seat. But that isn't where the peculiarity lies. The peculiar parts actually are in the language itself. It's that the New York law will require a police escort for an AV while it's in automated mode at all times, and the AV developer will have to pay for the cost of said police escort. Additionally, developers are required to submit their routes ahead of time before they're even testing on them, and they have to be accurate down to the nearest 1/10 of a mile, which is something I think most of us can't even do on our commutes. This also expires in April of 2018. It's going to be about a 2-year pilot programs. And the governor's office is reviewing and approving these projects. But one complaint that we've heard out of cities is that it doesn't exactly accommodate demonstrations of automated shuttles that can be used for some first mile, last mile solutions, and also for commercial and business parks. And it doesn't give cities like New York really any ability to play an active role in discussion around implementing AVs in the state. And finally, I think this is maybe the most troubling part, is that it uses a binary definition of AVs and only says autonomous vehicles, and really does not address the differences between the levels of automation, which might be the issue with using that really catch-all term for AV3s to AV5s, really misses the point on a lot of the capabilities and limitations of these vehicles.
I think I'm guilty of that myself. I think I've said autonomous vehicles today when I've actually been automated. But we know that a lot of states are starting to look at each other and starting to learn from one another, so hopefully they'll learn from what's going on in New York. Paul, let me answer. There's a couple of questions here about the various, how the states work together. Obviously, vehicles cross state borders all the time, especially here in the Northeast, where there are smaller states, obviously. Do states need to coordinate across borders? Is that going to make a difference? I mean, how should they even think about their relationships with one another?
We've talked to a lot of state governments over the past few months, and one thing that they're all in very much competition with each other, at least many of them are, to attract AV testing in their states. And it's an economic development tool that they want to encourage innovation and a homegrown tech industry. But one thing that happens when you talk to the AV developers is that a state is much more competitive in terms of a fertile ground for testing if they have coordinated laws with their neighbors. So a state will do themselves a favor in the testing phase by talking to their neighbors, by coordinating policies, and making sure that testing can cross seamlessly across borders, particularly in metro areas that share state borders, Washington or New York. In the long run, it's absolutely necessary that we have coordination across state borders so that when commercially ready applications for automated vehicles cross state lines, they're not also changing their definitions.
So it's really about their self-preservation, right? And yeah, for their competitive advantage to be coordinated.
That's right.
Let me ask, I think this is one for Stan, that the interesting byproduct of all the AVs is that by obeying traffic laws, by parking better, things like that, they'll reduce the millions of dollars that states and cities collect in things like traffic fines, for example. In the parking meters, I think is another thing people were asking about the questions. And the provocative recommendation in the paper is that states develop this per mile AV fee to fund investments and things like that. Is there a relationship between the state level, and we talked about this in the federal level and the state level, Is this something the cities should be doing as well? How do they make up for the loss of revenue, quote unquote, loss of revenue from AVs?
That's a good question. I definitely think it's a coordinated approach. As we've seen in other examples, some cities are being a little more aggressive about creating AV policies or considering AV policies. And just not to use a specific example, but there was a recent preemption by Texas in Austin around Uber or car sharing, and this is an example of where the state or the city didn't really talk to the state, and by doing that, they'd almost prevent this kind of preemption if the states are working with the cities to kind of really highlight the specific kind of charges or fees that they'd like to assess.
Yeah, the question about Texas, that came up a couple times in the question, so
yeah.
People are well aware of what's going on down there. I also think this issue of the workforce is an interesting one. That keeps coming up, and folks keep asking about that. Maybe, Greg, I think for you, the paper makes a good point that AVs could make difficult jobs like truck driving safer and potentially more attractive. There is a shortfall in truck drivers right now. So give me a little more specific. What should states really be doing to think about their future workforce vis-a-vis autonomous vehicles?
Certainly. I mean, one way for states to start doing it is to be funding these research efforts that aren't just focused on the technology, but also focused on their economic climates, also the other opportunities they could have in order to expand their competitive advantage as a state, both in developing AVs and maintaining AVs, but also in the variety of high-tech fields that may evolve in terms of repairing these complex sensors or monitoring these fleets of trucks. And this also is a particularly important opportunity for much of the Midwest in that there are two different groups that I think have really caught people's eyes recently. The first of which is the Smart Belt Coalition, which we've alluded to before, which is between Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, I believe, that are actually trying to foster this ecosystem of AV testing. And then there's another one, I believe it's called the Connected Prairie. They had an event yesterday that they declared National Autonomous Vehicle Day, and Secretary Lane Chow was there. And it's based in North Dakota, and they're finding ways to encourage investments in AV technology and other advanced technologies just within their regions, which is important not only for the state government, but also for the workforces.
So another thing that's going to change, I think, is also the infrastructure, right? And we have AVs driving on a network that was designed for non-AVs, right? And there's going to be lots of O&M costs and new kinds of engineering skills that are needed. So it's kind of related to the workforce, but the infrastructure question as well. But how do we think then differently about the infrastructure for AVs? We talked about the need for more of a fix-it-first policy and how to potentially fund that. But how different is the infrastructure for AVs going to be? How different is that going to be to operate and maintain versus what we have right now?
I think the bottom line here is that the AV developers are not waiting on a massive coordinated governmental effort to roll this out. The AV companies are putting this out on the roads as they exist right now, and frankly, if the technology is going to be successful, it's going to happen without this massive coordinated investment. With connected technologies and vehicle-to-infrastructure applications, that would require some input from governments, but that's not a necessary component of the initial rollout. So the ways states can be helpful is, again, supporting this through some small investments like state of good repair and fix it first, targeting areas like work zones, bridges, tight turns that have safety problems, and allowing the technology to display and roll out in a way that can be productive in safety without requiring significant or dramatic changes to how we invest in our roadways.
That's a great, if we remember nothing else, if there's not going to be a massive investment nationally, it's going to happen organically and iteratively.
That's right.
And so there's also a bunch of questions here that kind of collapse into one comment about the general public and their acceptance of all this. And I think, as we maybe all talk to people, there's a lot of concern, people about their own safety, particularly things like cybersecurity. And in the paper, you talk about these privacy or these principles that AV developers are going to have to adhere to address all kinds of things, cybersecurity, safety, things like that. But it feels a little anemic. How far are these going to be able to go, do you think, to making the general public comfortable with AVs, or is it going to require just a whole bunch of testing and pilots?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the statement of principles are not the end-all, be-all. That is laying the groundwork for future regulations or future action items, depending on how this rolls out. And the bottom line is, if consumers are going to accept it, it's really incumbent on the developers of the technology to demonstrate that it's safe, and that's consistently been applied across technologies for all of history. The reason why we're comfortable in going in airplanes or driving with trucks on the road or even taking trains is because over the decades, over the years, the industry has proven that the technology is safe, and there are federal requirements that the private companies meet safety standards, and that same regime will continue to exist with automated technology, and if the technology will be successful, it will prove itself.
And building off of that, one of the things that we keep on seeing, there is report after report after report after survey after survey after survey on consumer acceptance and consumer fears, but what we're seeing is that there's 50% acceptance rate of AVs with a 50% margin of error. That is to say, we need more research, we're far away from it, and to be honest, all of these results are, quite frankly, inconclusive because the technology just isn't on the road yet, and consumers aren't really able to know if they're comfortable or not with something they haven't even, for the most part, seen in person yet.
And so the last question, we're just about out of time, but there are a few, I guess there are concerns really about the AVs and the dominance of vehicles and the proliferation of vehicles around the road, particularly as it relates to public transit. So is there anything we can say? I know you talked a little bit about this with the workforce, but are there specific applications of autonomous vehicles for public transit? Is this back to the heaven and hell scenario that, Greg, you mentioned earlier? How do you think about public transit in this context?
It's absolutely not a heaven or hell scenario. And in fact, instead of thinking about AVs as displacing everything else as the car did for horse and buggies, instead we should think of it, as David Strickland said, as the spoken wheel. That is to say that AVs are going to help increase connections between all of the different aspects of our transportation infrastructure, this entire ecosystem, and can actually be used in a variety of ways in public transit. As I mentioned earlier, buses can be automated, but one of the earliest and best opportunities to integrate AVs into transit agencies will be through bus rapid transit or BRT systems. These allow you to have a closed course where there'll be significantly less variables that will allow AV buses to actually be put on the road sooner than they might be just for generally driving on highways or on city streets.
And I'll add that we're still a little ways away before transit agencies need to seriously consider how automated vehicles might upend their current business model. But transit agencies are not going away. We need to have public transit. It's going to be a vital way of how we get around in our urban areas. But transit agencies should start thinking about how they can start incorporating the technology, even with some little things, such as on their next bus procurement, make sure that the buses have the capability to have automated vehicle software, have the hardware within the system, so that if the technology then becomes available, they can take advantage of it. And then, since we're talking about states should encourage their transit agencies to do this, and of course, as Stan talked earlier, implement pilot programs for first mile, last mile, driverless shuttles, or other kind of public transit tests that can see and pilot and demonstrate how this technology can work, and help us think about our long-range plans in the future.
I think you're probably going to have the whole webinar just on the transit and AV connection as well. And there's a whole bunch of other questions that I know we didn't get to. So for folks on the phone who submitted things, again, thank you very much. Sorry if we didn't get to everything. We are going to stay very deeply involved in this issue. I said on autonomous vehicles, mostly through the experts who've helped inform all this work on eKnow's Digital City Advisory Group. If you'd like more information about that group, including how to join, please feel free to contact any of us. You can get our information on our website, or you can drop an email to publicaffairs@eknowtrans.org. I also want to encourage you to subscribe to eKnow Transportation Weekly. It's an invaluable resource on all aspects of transportation policy and practice, particularly a lot of the work we're doing on AVs are featured in that commentary and analysis. If you're not receiving that, you definitely should. So again, I want to thank you all for your participation today. Please stay involved with us. Have a great afternoon, everybody.